Welcome to Virginia U.S. History Standard 3A, where we will evaluate the economic characteristics of the colonies. And by economic, we'll be looking at the sources of money and the types of jobs that were prevalent in the different colonies. The essential understanding for this standard is colonial economies developed under an economic system called mercantilism. And this was a system prevalent in Europe during the time where European colonial powers relied on natural resources from colonies in an attempt to become self-sufficient. The colonies had this economic system in common, but the natural resources available varied dependent on things like climate, social conditions, and natural resources available. Our essential knowledge, what we want to get from this standard, is to know these economic characteristics of the colonial period, and we'll break them down by region. We'll start in the north in the New England colonies. These would be places like New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And in these colonies, the economy was based on things like shipbuilding, fishing and whaling, the cutting down of trees or lumbering, oftentimes for shipbuilding, those two often connected. We have a vocabulary word here, subsistence farming. Subsistence meaning just enough, not for profit. Unlike the southern colonies, we'll see in a moment, where large-scale farms existed, plantations, where far more than was needed by the family who owned the farm was needed, and those crops were then sold for profit. In New England, these are small family farms where the things that are grown are for the family on the farm. Just enough, not enough to turn a big profit. And especially later on in the colonial period, some manufacturing as the Industrial Revolution begins in the mid to late 1700s. These colonies in New England, they prospered. They did well and became rich during the 16 and 1700s. And in this region, it was largely a reflection of the Puritans' strong belief in the value of hard work and of thrift. Thrift referring to saving and not wasting money. And so that's what we want to know for the economies in our New England colonies. We see here the population of Massachusetts, just as an example, how it increased very rapidly from the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620 to over 250,000 by the end of the colonial period. We see a very steady increase in population. We see it reflected in things like the founding of colleges like Harvard in 1636, less than 20 years after the arrival of the Pilgrims. Moving on to the middle colonies. In the middle colonies, which would be places like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, the economy here in these colonies was based also on large shipbuilding. Some smaller scale farming, not just the subsistence farming we saw in New England. In the middle colonies, the growing season was a little bit longer, so some more food could be produced. And also trading. The trade was large in the middle colonies. Cities begin to develop in the middle colonies, such as New York and Philadelphia, and they begin to develop into seaports and commercial, meaning business and banking centers. We see here on this chart how early in the colonial period, back in 1690, Boston, up in the New England colonies, was the largest of the colonial cities, a position it held for about 50 years. But after about 1740, Boston's population kind of levels off. And we see Philadelphia and New York in the middle colonies, their populations increasing very rapidly. And by about 1760, both of those cities surpass Boston. By the time of the American Revolution in 1776, we see New York as the largest city in the colonies with a population of about 25,000 people. Moving on to the southern colonies, places like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. This is the largest region of colonies, and so the economy is a little more diversified here geographically. In the coastal lowlands, okay, so if we look here on this map, we're referring to the areas along the coast, the flatlands between the mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. On those, in these areas here, we see large plantations develop, large farms. Some of you might be familiar with George Washington's plantation at Mount Vernon. Um, uh, Largely based on slave labor, lots of people working, growing lots of crops. Um, Lots of outbuildings, lots of different fields, much larger scale agriculture than subsistence farming or in New England or the small scale farming in the middle Atlantic colonies. In the southern colonies, these plantations grew cash crops. Say that 10 times fast. These are crops grown to make money, okay, not just for the use of the family on the farm. And in particular, these are things like tobacco. We see dried tobacco leaves here, rice, and indigo, which was a plant used to make a particular color dye for clothing, which was very popular. And these cash crops were grown for export to Europe. Further inland in the southern colonies, we see here, so we're much further west of the Atlantic here as the geography starts to rise into the Appalachian foothills and the Appalachian Mountains. We see a different economy here. The land is not as good for farming in this region, so we're back to subsistence farming like we saw in New England. Families growing what they need, hunting, okay, a little more wilderness kind of area than the coastal lowlands, okay, and trade was a big part of the inland um, southern colonies economies. And that's what we need to know for Standard 3.